because, you know, there's nothing which can be compared to reading to form a writer. Somebody asked me in a radio show, if someone comes to you and says, I want to be a writer, I want to write, would you advise him or her to read a lot? And I answered, if I have to advise him to read a lot, then he's not going to be a writer. Because, you know, reading is the first natural thing he should feel. He should want. You couldn't imagine how many youngsters come to me wanting to know the secrets of writing and they do not consider reading. I have been always a passionate reader. And that's the real secret, or at least the first one to become a writer. There is no workshop, there is no professor that can replace reading. It is one of the first pleasures I can remember. Parents and teachers wonder today how to promote reading. They could try forbidding it, but worked for my generation. I remember my parents saying, Annie, don't read at the table, and my father said, Annie, that book is not for your age. And my mother said, no more reading at night, turn the lights off, why don't you leave that book and go to the park? And most of all, why don't you leave that book and go play with the other children? But I didn't know how to play with the other children. And as I found out later, this is common, very common among many writers to be. All I want to do was reading and reading and reading. I strongly remember my first book, which was Black Beauty. And I remember how I read it once and again until I really knew it by heart. And the first time I read it, it was terrible when it was over. And it was wonderful to discover I could read it again. And that's what I did. Of course, so much reading has its consequences, and my first consequences were inverse. I was an 8-year-old schoolgirl when I wrote my first poem. The subject was Mother's Day. Mother's Day in Argentina is in October, not in May, like here. May, isn't it? Here, Mother's Day? Yes, no, it's in October. And when I wrote my first poem, to my teachers and my mother's delight. And my first lost battle against censorship was closer than I could have ever imagined. Because, you know, being a writer in Argentina along many years meant to fight censorship too, and sometimes to fight censorship, sometimes simply to avoid censorship. In only 2 years from that first poem, I became the most famous poet of the whole school. But the principal, you know, was suspicious. Who actually wrote those poems? My father, my mother. So one day she invited me to her office, she made me sit next to her and told me to write a poem about a given subject. It was incredibly easy to me and proof enough for her. She had been certain that my mother was a real poet. After that, she used to ask me to write a poem whenever the school had an unusual celebration of any kind. For example, the school wished to celebrate the 150 years of Guatemala independence. Guatemala is just as much Latin America as we are. But you know, Argentina was never sure of its Latin American identity. We felt so European. We knew about France, about Italy, but Guatemala, what a remote and mysterious country. My school was small and poor, and they couldn't find enough information on the subject. There was not internet in those years. So they went for the usual solution and asked me to write a poem. They told me about the quetzal, the typical mute Guatemalan bird which, according to the legend, lost its voice when the first Spanish army invaded the country and killed most of the original native population. I was 10 years old, I did my best, and I couldn't understand why the principal didn't let me recite part of my verses. It took me many years to realize that I had had my first encounter with censorship. A few months before I wrote my innocent poem, the American Marines had invaded Guatemala, and they had knocked down the civilian president, Jacobo Arbenz. In Argentina, we were under one of the many military governments we had to put up with time and again in those days. The school principal thought that my verses against Spanish colonial army could be misunderstood as a communist statement against USA invasion. I wrote a lot when I was 10 because my teacher loved my verses. The following year, the new teacher didn't pay attention to my writing, and I suffered my first writer's block. This is how I discovered how important the external stimulus can be for the artist as a young girl. And not only that, I discovered vanity is one of the big engines that motivates a writer. There's nothing wrong with that. Writing can be, I used to say, distrust people who says, I write a lot, but then I just tear up all the papers. Well, you don't have to tear the papers now when you're writing a computer. No? I write a lot and then I delete everything. But those people will never be writers. Because, there's nothing wrong with that. Writing can be a fine psychological discharge. But anyone who doesn't keep what he writes will never be a writer because of simple lack of vanity. I still have the verses I wrote when I was 7. Well, I sometimes delete lots of things I write now, but those verses I keep. I made another interesting discovery about my writing. I could sell it. I used it to write my own work and 2 or 3 more texts bought by classrooms of mine who could pay for an A in Spanish, and they paid me in cannabis. I was in 7th grade when we learned about metrics in poetry. I laughed. It was simply unbelievable. And I told all my classmates, don't believe that. I write poetry. Metrics do not exist. Now imagine how could a poet, when the muse comes, when the inspiration comes, how could the poet start counting syllables? That doesn't happen. And of course, I went to my own writers, to my own verses, and I started counting the syllables. And I found, to my absolute amazement, most of them were 8 syllables verses, because the 8 syllables verses are the most common in the Spanish language. Most of them had 8 syllables, and some of them had 11 syllables. There were a lot of 12 syllables which are 11 syllable verses, but written. En decasílabos con problemas. But en decasílabos. And I was surprised, I was astonished, but I didn't know what I had discovered. Many years after that, I realized that I had discovered the importance of tradition. If you don't know tradition, if you are not aware of tradition, you'll be condemned to repeat it. The only way to be original, to write something different, is to know the rules, to recognize the rules, to be aware of the rules of tradition. And that's the only way to defy them and to get to originality.